Born in Ireland in 1685, George Berkeley was a philosopher who dared to challenge the very foundation of our understanding of reality. Educated at Trinity College, Dublin, Berkeley's intellectual journey led him to question the dominant philosophies of his time. Boldly confronting the empiricist ideas of John Locke, he offered a radical alternative known as idealism. Berkeley's life and work were deeply intertwined with his unwavering belief in the power of perception. His philosophical inquiries were not mere academic exercises, but stemmed from a deep desire to comprehend the nature of existence. Characterized by clarity and intelligence, his writings made complex philosophical subjects accessible. Berkeley's influence extended beyond the confines of academia, sparking debates and discussions that continue to resonate today. His contributions to philosophy, particularly the development of subjective idealism, were significant. This philosophical stance proposes that reality, as we experience it, is fundamentally mental. In other words, objects and their properties exist only insofar as they are perceived by a mind. This radical notion challenged the prevailing view that material objects exist independently of our minds. Throughout his life, Berkeley held various positions, including Bishop of Cloyne in Ireland. Yet his philosophical pursuits remained a constant. He dedicated himself to exploring the ramifications of idealism, defending his views against critics and refining his arguments. His work continues to inspire philosophers and challenge our understanding of the relationship between the mind and the world. At the heart of Berkeley's philosophical project lay a fundamental question. How do we acquire knowledge about the external world? This question, known as the problem of knowledge, had preoccupied philosophers for centuries. Unsatisfied with existing answers, Berkeley sought a more satisfactory explanation. The prevailing view during Berkeley's time was that our senses provide us with direct access to an external material world. However, Berkeley argued that this assumption led to a number of philosophical problems. He questioned how we could be sure that our sensory experiences accurately reflected the true nature of external objects. Berkeley's skepticism stemmed from his belief that our senses only provide us with sensations, not direct knowledge of the objects themselves. He argued that we cannot infer the existence of mind-independent objects based solely on our subjective experiences. To illustrate this point, Berkeley invited us to consider the nature of qualities such as color or taste. He argued that these qualities are not inherent properties of objects, but rather sensations that exist only in the mind of the perceiver. For example, the redness of an apple is not an intrinsic quality of the apple itself, but a sensation that arises in our minds when we look at it. This led Berkeley to distinguish between the things we perceive and the assumed external objects that cause our perceptions. John Locke, a prominent English philosopher, had a profound influence on Berkeley's thought. Locke's empiricism, which emphasized the role of experience in acquiring knowledge, provided a starting point for Berkeley's own philosophical investigations. However, Berkeley ultimately diverged from Locke's views, developing a distinct form of idealism. Locke had proposed a distinction between primary and secondary qualities. Primary qualities, such as shape and motion, were thought to be inherent properties of objects. Secondary qualities, such as color and taste, were considered subjective experiences that arose in the mind of the perceiver. While Berkeley accepted the distinction, he challenged Locke's interpretation. He argued that both primary and secondary qualities are ultimately mental phenomena. Berkeley pointed out that our perception of qualities like shape and size is just as subjective as our perception of color or taste. For instance, the size of an object appears to change depending on our distance from it. This led Berkeley to conclude that all qualities, whether primary or secondary, exist only as ideas in the mind. He argued that there is no need to posit the existence of mind-independent objects to account for our experiences. Instead, he proposed that reality consists solely of minds and their ideas. Berkeley's rejection of the distinction between primary and secondary qualities marked a radical departure from the prevailing philosophical views of his time. He argued that all qualities, without exception, depend on the mind for their existence. This challenged the notion of a material world existing independently of our perceptions. To illustrate his point, Berkeley invited us to consider the act of perceiving an object, such as a table. When we perceive a table, we experience a range of sensations, such as its color, shape, texture, and smell. Berkeley argued that these sensations are not inherent properties of the table itself, but rather qualities that exist only in our minds. If we were to remove all perceiving minds from existence, Berkeley argued, the table, along with all its perceived qualities, would cease to exist. For Berkeley, to be is to be perceived. In other words, the existence of an object is contingent upon its being perceived by a mind. Berkeley's argument challenged the common-sense view that objects exist independently of our minds. He argued that our belief in a mind-independent material world is based on a misunderstanding of the nature of perception. By blurring the lines between the perceiver and the perceived, Berkeley offered a radical perspective on the relationship between the mind and reality.